Next, I'd like to invite Marian MacLeod from Children in Scotland, where she is the Senior Policy and Parliamentary Officer who's going to talk about the development of the National Parenting Strategy in Scotland. Yeah, we just use the desk.
I think I'll stand over here because I'm not a kind of podium person, so if you can hear me all right standing like this, I'd probably prefer that. No, I don't think you're going to hear me. Right. I think that one of the disadvantages in going last is that, I always kind of get much better ideas than I had to start with, so I end up with something completely illegible like this. So I hope you'll bear with me if it turns out to be kind of mildly incomprehensible. Thanks very much for inviting me. I've had a pleasant few days in your very welcoming city, and it's been very interesting and inspiring to hear that there's a strong political commitment, at least a stated strong political commitment, and to hear the contributions from the special interest group and the very good evidence that Professor Mary Daly has just given us. I'm also encouraged to see that there's such a good turnout, because I think that shows the level of interest there is in issues like this, and that people are starting to realise that what happens to children is not as disconnected as what happens to parents as perhaps had been previously thought. Children in Scotland, to start off, is the National Network for Children's Services in Scotland. We have members, over 400, across the public, voluntary, independent sectors. We also have academic institutions and professional groups. So we are not representing a particular sector of provision. We are set up to represent the best interests of children. So all our campaigning, influencing activity has got very much that focus. And we are very clear that the best interests of children are best served by supporting parents to do the best job possible. My own background is that I was originally a social worker, and after many years in probably from the perspective of my own sanity as well as the well-being of the general public, I only actually practiced for a few years, but I've done development work, service development and policy development since then. And I think it's probably fair to say that one of the conclusions I've reached in 33 years of doing this is that most of the problems that I have come across and most of the professionals I've come across did not think that it wouldn't have been better if the problem hadn't existed in the first place. So I think this is the point of view that I start. So we start from the kind of discussions of prevention versus cure. It's not a fiscal argument. It's an argument about what is actually brings about the best outcomes. And I think, we need to think about what we mean when we talk about best outcomes for children and families. I thought I'd start off with a famous Dubliner. I was going to tell a kind of amusing anecdote, but thought, well, after I'd said my slide, probably everyone in Ireland has heard this, so I'd be obliged if you kind of laugh politely anyway. Brendan Behan was apparently found after a long session collapsed in a Dublin street and was rushed to hospital. And was hooked up to the various kind of machines to kind of resuscitate him. And after he'd come round, the cardiologist came round and was showing him the cardiograph and how his heartbeat and heart rate had returned to normal, and said to him, "Mr. Behan, that may be the most important the most important bit of writing you have ever done." And Brendan Behan said, "Yes, and it comes straight from the heart." And I think most of what I'm going to say comes straight from the heart as well. I've got no kind of inspiring quotes, graphs or charts, but it's based on my experience of working with parents and children over many years, and what things have been shown to be effective and what things have been shown to be less effective. So, the Scottish Government has a parenting strategy. I'll talk a bit about the development of that later. We're a small country, but as you can see, the first statement there, making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up, is drawn directly from the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. So, despite our size, we are clearly not under-ambitious in our objectives. Though I would say that if you look at any of the statistics from the OECD, Eurostat, etc., we probably have some distance to travel before we could actually reach that point. However, the Scottish Government was elected in 2011, and one of its commitments was to develop a national strategy to support parents. So I'll talk first of all about why do we need a parenting strategy anyway, not just in Scotland, but generally. So I think the first reason that you would have a parenting strategy is understanding that what happens to children, what happens to parents, is not a personal or individual thing. We all have an investment in this if we believe in any kind of, social connection. So the prevailing political philosophy in Scotland is that we all have a stake in this. So it's important for our whole society, our whole nation, our whole country, that we invest in supporting families. The reason that we want to do this is we know, and there's been quite a bit of talk about evidence, and I'll come on to some of that later, the outcomes for children are integrally connected to and influenced by the parenting that they experience. So it's very clear from some of the data we've gathered in Scotland that I'll refer to that even at very early stages in life, it's very clear how what children have experienced is showing in definable and measurable ways at very early life stages. And I suppose the third thing is an acceptance that government has a critical role to play. I think it's interesting if you look at the French experience. A country, as I'd call it, has more layers of government than you can shake a stick at, but the parenting strategy is seen as something that's very much a kind of bottom-up experience and rooted in local communities. And I think that's very in line with the general political ideology in France of community resources. And it's not just in parenting, but if you go to communities in France, even very small communities, they have a level of community-led infrastructure that I think has never gone away here, but I think certainly in Scotland we are trying to recreate in probably quite an artificial way. But Scotland have accepted that the government have a clear leadership role here. They also have the role in developing the strategic infrastructure and providing the resources that enable local authorities and local communities to support children and their families better, and to enable parents to do the best they can in bringing up their children. Our particular circumstances in Scotland. Firstly, we have a very interesting study that's been going on in Scotland since 2006. It's a large longitudinal cohort study called Growing Up in Scotland. And when it started in 2006, it took two cohorts of children. One was a group of children who were born that year. The other was a group of children who were 3 years old in that year. They have subsequently added a further cohort of new babies to that. So it's a very large sample. It's not a representative sample. It has been deliberately weighted to try to capture more information about particular groups. And it's been pretty successful in retaining involvement throughout the 6 or 7 years it's now been operating. So we now have a lot of data about children in Scotland, about how their individual experiences and how the collective experiences, for example, major shifts in national policy, have affected the whole population. But one thing that is very, very clearly emerged from that, if we didn't already know it, was that many children were falling behind very early in life in their health and development. That the poorest quintile of our 2-year-olds had fallen significantly behind in their cognitive development by the age of 2. Because we've been able to follow up these children for several years subsequently, what's even more concerning is that by 5 they had fallen further behind. So the 2 years of universal preschool education that everyone gets was actually apparently serving to increase the gap between the poorest and the best off. Now, I think this flies in the face of some other evidence that we've heard. And I think it is certainly true that quality preschool early education and care can make a big difference to children's outcomes. But I think it's like what's happened since the inception of the National Health Service nearly 70 years ago now, that the impact of for example, on longevity, has been much better felt among the better educated, more advantaged in the community than it has among the poorest in the community. And the same thing happens with any other universal provision. That children who are better equipped, people who are healthier lifestyle choices, will benefit more from the universal services. So I think this is an important factor to remember when we think about parenting strategies and how we support parents. What's even more worrying is that those who fell behind in early life did not catch up. That this was mirrored, and we have longitudinal health studies, and Mary referred to some of them, which show the lifelong health impact of some of that early deprivation. That falling behind, and this is something that the Growing Up in Scotland has very clearly identified, was related to the quality of inputs. And I put that in inverted commas because, it seems a bit kind of, I don't know, like manufacturing kind of, oriented. And I think we do an awful lot of bringing in models from sectors that seem very little to do with, the way people interact to one another. The Scottish Government's just a big strategy that's based on a model that's been adapted from the aviation industry. So for its early years health services, we'll watch that one with interest. Lack of the right inputs was highly correlated with poverty and other kinds of disadvantage. Now, I think I've used the word correlation very advisedly, because what's clear is it's not a causal relationship, it's a correlation. And that just because you are poor does not mean that you will be a bad parent or that your children will not have good outcomes. But for one reason, poverty increases the level of stress in families, so it probably makes it more difficult to do the things that you might think and know are the right things to do. But also, you are more likely to be in circumstances where you have not experienced the kind of parenting inputs yourself that will give you the best equipment to be the best parent. Some parents experience specific difficulties in looking after older children, and I think that's, I think we've talked a lot about youth justice and things that happen to children as they get older. But I think it's probably fair to say that if you track back the histories of most of the children who have very problematic behaviour as teenagers, that is usually rooted in things that went on earlier on in their life. Failure to do well at school, living in communities where they were exposed to negative influences and lots of unhealthy lifestyle opportunities, etc. So I think it's very clear that while parenting is clearly something that has to go across the age range of the children, that if we get it right at early stages, it is much more likely to be sustainable later on. There are high costs associated with problems rooted in difficulties in parenting. If we have a child in Scotland who ends up placed in secure accommodation, that costs in excess of £200,000 a year. Now, I don't know what it would cost to support families and children on a much more universal basis at early stages, but if you look at OECD figures, we actually are spending more than the Nordic countries per head on children. We're just not getting very great value for our money because we're not doing the best and the right things. Some parents did not have and couldn't readily access support. Now, I think the issue about parental support, I think, is very important. No parent brings up their children without support. And it's nonsensical to imagine that they do. A lot of parents find their own supports. I had the Penelope Leach book by my side and perused it rigorously when my child did anything kind of alarming or unusual. I had parents that gave advice, some of which was good and some of which was perhaps not quite as constructive. I had friends who had children. I had ways of finding out information myself and family and a community of support that not everybody has. So it's not a case of, some parents don't need support and some do. Some parents find their own a lot more readily than others. So that's some of the reasons why the Scottish Government developed the strategy. How am I doing for time, Toby? Right, okay. So I'll just tell you a wee bit about how the Scottish Government developed its strategy. Firstly, they went out and asked a huge range of practitioners. Now Mary mentioned about the differences in Europe depending on the kind of disciplines and professions that are more involved with this. I think one of the things the Scottish Government did was made sure that they comprehensively covered disciplines and professionals from the front line. So from general practitioners to teachers to early years workers, social workers, community groups, voluntary organisations. So it wasn't looking purely at the families with a high level of need and a high level of dysfunction. It was trying to look at the whole spectrum of the professions and disciplines that engaged with children and their families, and how they did that, and what were the issues that were arising in terms of parenting and children's well-being. From that they developed the key themes. They had a number of engagement events for professionals, practitioners, managers across the board on the draft strategy. Now, the Scottish Minister specified that the strategy had to make a practical difference for families, i.e. it wasn't a case of we developed a nice, colourful document that, kind of everyone kind of had on their shelf, that it was actually meant to translate into some practical change that was going to achieve better outcomes. So there were some additional resources put into it, or to be more exact, there were resources that were diverted from other parts of the budget that were put into it. And I think this is a particularly important thing. Organisations were asked to host groups. So voluntary organisations, bits of the health service, for example, that were working with parents who had substance misuse or alcohol misuse issues, mental health organisations, were asked to host groups of parents who used their service so that the government could find out what their issues were and what were the things they identified as their need for help and support, and what they thought of the things and the themes that the government was proposing. So 1,500 parents contributed, and that was from a wide range of circumstances, and I'll talk about some of that in a minute. And the final version was launched in 2012, so it's only about 8 months old. So we have developed and begun to put it into practice, but I don't think we could probably claim that we're, that we're near there yet. So what's in it? Firstly, it underlines absolutely the importance of parents to a child's healthy development. It acknowledged that parents need skills and knowledge to provide their children with appropriate care and support. Now, we have an assessment framework in Scotland called Getting It Right for Every Child, which by next year will actually be underpinned by statute. And this means that every child is assessed at an early stage in life by a health visitor who's a public health nurse that works particularly with children in Scotland. And that over the first 6 months of life, the health visitor carries out an assessment and then works out what is the appropriate level of support that these parents and this child needs for them to do as well as possible. Now, for some families, that may mean that they just use the universal services. For some, it might mean that the health visitor needs to spend additional time with them. For some, it may mean that they are referred on to helping agencies or particular programmes, or indeed community groups or other informal networks in the community. But certainly the intention is that we individualise and personalise the kind of help that children and their families get. And I think this is very, very important because I think, that this is one of the things that programme-based approaches find it hard to take into account. We are not all alike. Families are all different. Their configuration of circumstances are all different. Of course they can have things in common. But in the end of the day, you can address the common issues, but families are likely to have things that are personal to them and things they need over and above the things that a programmed approach can give them. We also are about to enshrine in statute in Scotland our commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we very clearly see that our practical application of the UNCRC is done by ensuring that children's rights underpin the whole question of how we support parents and parental responsibility. Children have no influence on what kind of parents they are born to. It seems, therefore, very inconsistent to leave them to sink or swim, depending on what quality of parents that they end up with. So, if you take a children's rights approach, I think there is a necessary mirroring of that in what support parents are given to ensure that that child is not disadvantaged and is brought up as well as possible and achieves the best possible outcomes through the support their parents get. It covers some specific issues like attachment, and I think this is a very, very critical area and something we're knowing more and more about, its particular relevance and importance in children's development. And we have Suzanne Zadyk, who's an academic who works in Scotland, who has done a lot of work on early communication and attachment, she has produced booklets. She has a website which has got lots of really useful information. Saber-toothed tigers and teddy bears, a brief guide to understanding attachment is one of the easiest, is one of the recent ones. And this is the way she kind of describes how parents protect children and how children develop, how attachment helps children develop internal resilience and strength. And she did a presentation at the Scottish Parliament of some of our work last year, which was showing how early communication, even with very new babies, can impact on how they develop and learn and how they respond. This audience of kind of politicians and middle-class professionals, when you asked them for questions at the end, were responded in quite strangely, because everyone stood up one after another to say how bad a parent they'd been. And I feel so guilty now. I didn't make enough eye contact when I was changing the nappy, And I said, well, your child's probably, they might have drunk a few times and made some inappropriate friendships, but they probably went to university and have generally done okay. And it's, this is aimed at the people who don't understand things like, basic communication, and that talking to a baby helps their communication and their cognitive development, etc. But things like play and all these things, stimulation, engagement, setting boundaries and access to support. And I think, what's quite interesting, you think about setting boundaries and discipline. I was at a workshop last week. There was two parents with moderate learning disabilities who were talking about some of their experiences and how the things they were struggling with was setting consistent, possibly unsurprising when you think they're people with learning disabilities, was setting appropriate boundaries and discipline and being consistent. But they were offered help with showing them how to cook a meal, because that was what was on offer. Because people with learning disabilities needed to do know how to do these practical tasks. And they were saying, I know how to cook a meal. What I needed was somebody to help me work out what was appropriate behaviour for a 14-year-old boy, and if he didn't want to do it, what things I could do to encourage him to do that. So I think, things like that, we need to think, who is it we're trying to reach and what are the issues they're facing? Not what are the issues our service would like them to be facing, but what their actual lives are like and what they need help with. So the strategy also covered needs of some of these specific groups: parents whose children in the care system, parents whose children were in prison, and that can be a very disruptive, as I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, experience in a family, and how, particularly with fathers, but also with mothers, how these kind of attachments and family relations are sustained during that period. And in Scotland, we have actually more children affected by a parent's imprisonment every year than we do whose parents get divorced. Which was quite a surprising statistic to me, but I did check it and it's true. Kinship carers. We have a lot of children who are being looked after by grandparents, uncles, aunties, other relatives, because their parents are at that point unable to look after them. And corporate parents, children who are in the public care system. We have some very worthy and good examples of that. If you're a child in care, you get a kind of free access to the swimming pool, which, is... I think they got the corporate bit, but they didn't quite get the parent bit, so we're working on that one. And importantly, the equal responsibilities and roles of fathers and parents are acknowledged, whether or not they are actually living in the household. So what will it do? Better coordinated support. Now, we've heard a lot about what support is. I think support is what people need. and what people need to make the best of the opportunities that they have in what can be the most rewarding and satisfying experience of your life, which is bringing up children well. And they're going to do that by some things like, providing some additional funds, as I said, trying to expand learning about parenting in the school curriculum. I've got 2 daughters who, as of 2 weeks ago, I no longer am a parent of anyone at school, so thankfully that's all behind me now. But the learning about parenting that they got was, they got taught about a condom and how to put on a condom, which, kind of preventing it seemed to be the kind of, the main focus of parenting in the school curriculum. Also that some kids, the girls who were kind of in the care system were kind of singled out. You need to learn about bringing up a baby because basically we know you're going to have one very shortly, which I thought was, kind of a bit undermining in terms of the kind of, aspirations. But I thought it was also quite strange in that presumably most of the children in the school were likely to be parents at some point in their life, and that it didn't seem to be important that they learned about it, and that they learned about good parenting and about, preparing well for parenting and being the best parent they could when that time in their life came. We also recognise that, as I say, parents were having issues about older children, about children when they entered the school system, etc. So there was different kinds of information and support people needed. Promoting attachment, I've talked about that, and positive relationships. And removing the stigma from the need to receive help with being a parent. Now, as I say, everyone needs help with being a parent. There are, maybe there are 1 or 2 very charismatic and able individuals that don't. But, by and large, everyone I've ever come across in their life has needed some support to bring up their children well. So, what does the strategy aim to develop? Firstly, a clear picture exists currently. Secondly, to break the cycle of transmission of ineffective parenting. Now, I've heard people say it's about poverty. It's not about poverty. There's been some very powerful research done about the likelihood of poorer outcomes for children based on your socio-economic circumstances. And yes, of course, the risks are higher if you're poor. But it's the ineffective parenting is the thing that gets transmitted. And that, of course, has impact on people's educational attainment, their employment, and also, the kind of their future life chances. So that's the thing that can make the difference between having a good outcome in a poor family and having a bad outcome in a poor family. And I talked about some of the Growing Up in Scotland findings earlier on, and what's even more worrying is that if you looked at the richest children, the top quintile, who were doing poorly in cognitive development at 2, they have overtaken the poor children who were doing well by 7. Because these are the parents who go, oh gosh, my child doesn't have enough vocabulary, and so I better read to them more, and they respond to it. And even these bright wee things at 2 are not getting the kind of ongoing stimulation and support that they need to help them capitalise on that, early potential. Fathers have mentioned additional support through universal services. Now, I don't just mean the kind of universal services that are actually not really universal services because either people don't use them, and this is something, again, we found through Growing Up in Scotland. The parents who were at highest risk are the ones who are least likely to take up an opportunity that was offered to them. Whereas, the kind of worried well, if you use the health service, or the ones that were far more likely, and this kind of corresponds to the kind of neurotic kind of response to Suzanne Zadig's research. That we need to raise public awareness, and the Scottish Government has done things like that through like the Play, Talk, Read campaign, which is about engagement and early stimulation. And that we need to address the needs of specific groups, and I've mentioned, people have mentioned young parents, lone parents, etc. But I think most importantly, it needs to be about reducing the gap between the least and the most advantaged. And it's very clear that that emerged as both very early, but also continues through life if it's not addressed. And it's also important that when we talk about universal services, this means the whole workforce that's engaged with children and families. It's not just about, well, that's the province of particular people who've got a parenting worker tag on them. It's the province of everyone who works with children and their families. I include people like school teachers and everyone else through the workforce in that. As I say, fortunately, I'm no longer the parent of anyone at school, but any of you who is, I'm sure the experience is not dissimilar to mine, in as much as there's a huge variation in the quality of contact, welcoming, engagement that you've had from the teachers you've experienced. And I think that these kind of services can be critically important in engaging parents with children's learning and well-being. So what do we need to do to make the strategy real? Firstly, how am I doing? Firstly, I think we've got to, as I've said, acknowledge that most parents will bring up their children well. You know, most parents' children will do all right. That they will find out things themselves, they will tap into provision, they will use their own networks within their family and within their community to do the right things. Some will do so when they're provided with some help. So some people, you know, a 12-week programme might be just the thing that makes the difference between them doing well and them doing not so well. Some of them just need told, you know, the public library's free, if you go there you can get, you know, any number of baby books if you can't afford to buy them, and you just go through them with your child, and we've got quite some good kind of pre-literacy stuff that's going on in Scotland, like, you know, BookBug and Bookstart. And that was, you know, to say to families who perhaps didn't have, you know, great literacy themselves, doesn't really matter. You know, this isn't about, you know, how well you can read. This is about you bonding and sharing with your child. This is about you talking about things, exposing them to language and connecting with them. And that, you know, so you know, if you just go along to the library, you can get any amount of stuff for nothing. When I went along to our local library, which was kind of, you know, a community of teachers and social workers and folk like that, next to a very kind of deprived area in Edinburgh, and all the folk who I saw there with my kids were all the other teachers and social workers, and all the folk who actually were, you know, on their doorstep of the kind of, you know, the families on benefit and the families who had a lot of, you know, social issues. I never saw them in the library, and yet it's a free service that was right on their doorstep. Some people need supported to use these universal provision. They need to be taken along, they need to be helped, they need to be shown how to use these kind of services if they've no history or tradition of doing so. Some people will do so partially if they're provided with help. There are some families that, you know, will manage some things, but they'll not manage others, like the parents with learning disabilities I was talking. They might cook well enough, they might keep their house clean enough, but they struggle with issues like discipline or you know, communication. You know, it seems kind of blindingly obvious when you think about it that, for example, measuring cognitive ability in early life, you know, one of the tests they use is the vocabulary the child has and word recognition, because that's highly correlated to educational attainment. And yet, it's kind of obvious that a parent with learning disabilities will probably expose their child to a smaller range of vocabulary than someone who's got a university degree. And yet we wait till that child does badly in school and starts to fall behind before we actually intervene. And I think these are the kind of messages we've got to think about. You know, well, realistically, what is this family going to need for that child to do well and to try and provide them with that? And some people need ongoing help and sustained contact. You know, that some of the learning disabilities isn't going to get better. You know, somebody who perhaps dips in and out of addiction problems might need a lot of support and help throughout that child's life. But I think as a society, our investment in how well our children do is an investment for all our futures. And I think this is what the Scottish Government has tried to do in developing its strategy. Right, a few kind of caveats. We've talked, you know, you've heard a lot about parenting programmes. You know, there are no magic bullets. You know, most of the parenting programmes, as Mary has talked a bit about what works, work with some issues to some extent. They don't solve everyone's problems. And I think one of the main criticisms there have been about some of these programme approaches, particularly the American ones, is they've not really taken a lot of account of context. And the kind of systemic matters like, you know, poverty and disadvantage, you know, poor communities, poor, you know, support, these programmes do not really address this. I think we've got to be clear that, you know, people are not, you know, kind of, it's not like a construction line for, you know, making cars or something like that. I mean, you know, Henry Ford, you know, observed people putting cars together manually and then systematise that into a production line. Now, that works with making cars. It doesn't work with changing people. And I think, you know, that we have to be very careful about making sure that whatever programmes we have are actually making sure that we get the right people to the right programmes. And direct people to additional support much more easily if you have a good and high level of universal provision. One size does not fit all. Input does not always guarantee output. And programmes are useful and can effect positive change, but are rarely sufficient on their own. And you might be wondering what the ukulele is, and that's actually mine. And I was given it as a present by my daughters a year past at Christmas, and I've gone along to a class religiously for the last year and a half. And you'll be relieved I'm not going to inflict it on you, but I can now play House of the Rising Sun, which has got 5 chords. So, you know, I think the message from that that brought about the issue. We can't get it right for children without getting it right for parents. If you're to make that family functional, you have to work with the whole family as a system. When I did my social work training, systems theory was all the rage then. I've probably moved on to, you know, that's probably so last century now. But I think there are elements of value still in it. That if you don't look at families as whole systems and look at children in isolation to their parents, you're probably less likely to have a good outcome. We need to work on probability rather than actuality. To prevent harm and optimise well-being. So what I was saying about early assessment and individualised reaction to that needs to be that, I think, who's got no qualifications, with a kind of, you know, who's kind of 17 and the dad's a kind of, you know, a drug addict who's in the jail, is probably less likely to go to university than, you know, I am of the royal family, you know, for example. Well, no, that's probably not a good example. Than a child born of middle-class degree-educated parents. But, you know, that is not a prediction. There are plenty of people from deprived backgrounds who went to university. There are plenty of people who went, none of them had actually stopped smoking, you know. Well, you know, it doesn't actually matter whether they enjoyed coming along to the groups or whatever. It's there. If there's anything anyone would want me to follow up or send them, you know, I'm happy to do so. Please take one. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Marian. Now, we've got about